The dust from the stranger's boots had barely settled on Main Street when Frank Easton heard the cruel laughter erupting from outside the general store in Columbia, California, on that sweltering afternoon in July of 1878. Frank had been loading supplies onto his wagon, preparing for the week-long journey back to his family's ranch in the foothills, when the commotion caught his attention. Three well-dressed men stood in a semicircle around a young woman whose simple traveling dress was covered in road dust. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins, and her face was flushed with what Frank immediately recognized as humiliation rather than heat. "Look at this one, boys," sneered a man in an expensive suit that marked him as one of the mining executives who had been flooding into town lately. "Thinks she can waltz into Columbia looking like something the cat dragged in and expect respectable folks to treat her like a lady." The woman's hands trembled as she clutched a worn carpetbag, but she lifted her chin defiantly. "I am merely passing through, sir. I meant no offense to anyone." "No offense?" Another man laughed harshly. "You're an offense just standing there. What kind of woman travels alone without a chaperone? We all know what that means." Frank felt his jaw tighten. He had seen enough cruelty in his 32 years to recognize it instantly. And something about the way this woman stood her ground despite her obvious fear stirred something protective in his chest. Without thinking too deeply about it, he set down the sack of flour he had been holding and walked toward the group with long, purposeful strides. "Seems to me the only offense here is three grown men ganging up on a lady who has done nothing but arrive in town," Frank said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that came from years of working cattle and handling difficult situations. "Why don't you gentlemen move along and let her be?" The first man turned to face Frank, his expression shifting from amusement to irritation. "This isn't your concern, Cowboy. We're just having a bit of fun." "Fun at someone else's expense isn't fun at all," Frank replied evenly. "It's cowardice, plain and simple. Now I asked you politely to move along. I won't be asking a third time." The men exchanged glances, clearly weighing their options. Frank was tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of weathered strength that came from a lifetime of hard work. His hand rested casually near the Colt revolver at his hip, though he had no intention of drawing it unless absolutely necessary. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, the suited man sneered. "Keep your charity case, Cowboy. She'll bring you nothing but trouble." As the men walked away, still muttering insults under their breath, Frank turned his attention to the woman. Up close, he could see that beneath the dust and dishevelment, she was quite beautiful. Her eyes were an unusual shade of green that reminded him of the meadows in spring, and despite her obvious exhaustion, there was intelligence and determination in her gaze. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice slightly unsteady. "You did not have to do that." "Yes, I did," Frank replied simply. "No one deserves to be spoken to that way. Are you all right, miss?" She nodded, though he could see she was close to tears. "I am now. I have been traveling for 3 days, and I am afraid I must look quite disreputable, but I assure you I am a respectable woman. My name is Julia Vance, and I am a schoolteacher. I was supposed to meet the family I am staying with here in Columbia, but there has been some confusion about the arrival date." Frank removed his hat, revealing sandy brown hair that needed a trim. "Frank Easton, madam. Pleased to make your acquaintance, though I am sorry it had to be under such circumstances. Have you had anything to eat today?" Julia hesitated, and Frank noticed the way her hand went protectively to her carpetbag. He suspected she did not have much money left after her journey. "I was just about to find the boarding house," she said, not quite answering his question. "The boarding house serves a fine supper, but it won't be ready for another few hours," Frank said. There is a restaurant just down the street that makes the best beef stew this side of Sacramento. Would you do me the honor of joining me? Consider it an apology on behalf of Columbia for that unfortunate welcome you received." Julia looked at him with those remarkable green eyes, and Frank could see her weighing the propriety of accepting such an invitation from a stranger against her obvious hunger and exhaustion. Finally, she gave him a small smile that transformed her entire face. "That is very kind of you, Mr. Easton. I would be grateful to accept." Frank picked up her carpetbag, despite her protests, and guided her down the dusty street toward Sadie's restaurant, a modest establishment run by a widow who had the best cooking skills in the county. As they walked, Frank noticed the way Julia looked around Columbia with interest rather than fear. The town had grown rapidly since gold was discovered in the area back in 1850, and though the initial rush had died down, it remained a bustling community with a mix of miners, ranchers, and businessmen. Inside the restaurant, Sadie herself came to take their order, her eyebrows raising slightly at seeing Frank with a woman. He was known in town as a solitary figure, dedicated to his ranch and rarely seen socializing. "2 of your beef stew specials, Sadie, with fresh bread and coffee," Frank said. "And maybe some of that apple pie if you have any left." "For you, Frank, I always have pie," Sadie said with a wink before heading back to the kitchen. Julia removed her gloves and smoothed her hair self-consciously. "Everyone seems to know you here." "I have been ranching in these parts for about 10 years now," Frank explained. "Took over my father's spread after he passed. It is not much, but it is home." "I am sorry about your father," Julia said gently. "That must have been difficult." "It was 5 years ago now," Frank said, surprised at how easy it was to talk to her. "He taught me everything I know about ranching and about treating people right. He would have done the same thing I did back there, probably with a few choice words added in." Julia laughed softly, and the sound was like music to Frank's ears. "He sounds like he was a good man." "The best," Frank agreed. "What brings a schoolteacher all the way to Columbia, if you do not mind my asking?" Julia's expression grew more serious as Sadie brought their coffee. "I was teaching in a small town in Oregon, but the school closed due to lack of funding. I saw an advertisement for a teaching position here in Columbia, and the pay was good. I have a younger sister back in Boston who is studying to be a nurse, and I send her money when I can. Our parents passed away from influenza 3 years ago." Frank felt a pang of sympathy. "That is a heavy burden to carry alone." "We all carry our burdens," Julia said, wrapping her hands around the warm coffee cup. "I am fortunate to have work I love. Teaching children is the most rewarding thing I have ever done. Each child is like a small miracle, full of potential and possibility." The passion in her voice was unmistakable, and Frank found himself leaning forward, drawn in by her enthusiasm. "How did you come to be a teacher?" "My mother was a teacher before she married," Julia explained. "She taught me to read when I was very young, and I fell in love with books and learning. When my parents died, my sister and I needed to support ourselves. Teaching seemed like the natural choice. What about you?" "Did you always want to be a rancher?" Frank considered the question as Sadie brought their steaming bowls of stew. "I suppose I never thought about doing anything else. I grew up on that ranch, learned to ride before I could walk properly. There is something about working the land, raising cattle, being part of something bigger than yourself. It gets in your blood." They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, and Frank noticed the way Julia closed her eyes in pleasure at the first taste of the stew. She was clearly famished, though she ate with perfect manners despite her hunger. "This is delicious," she said. "I cannot remember the last time I had a proper hot meal." "Sadie is a treasure," Frank agreed. She came out here with her husband during the gold rush. He died in a mining accident, and she opened this restaurant to support herself. She has been feeding half the town ever since." Julia looked thoughtful. "It seems like everyone here has a story of hardship overcome. It is quite inspiring, really." "The West attracts a certain kind of person," Frank said. "Those willing to work hard and start fresh. Of course, it also attracts the kind of men you met earlier, looking to get rich quick and not caring who they step on in the process." "You are not like that," Julia observed. Meeting his eyes directly, Frank felt his ears grow warm at the compliment. "I try not to be. My father always said that a man's character is defined by how he treats those who can do nothing for him in return. Those men were picking on you because they could, because you were alone and vulnerable. That does not sit right with me." "Well, I am very grateful you were there," Julia said softly. "I was beginning to think I had made a terrible mistake coming to Columbia." "Give the town another chance," Frank urged. "Most folks here are good people. You just had the misfortune of running into the bad apples first." As they finished their meal and moved on to the apple pie, Frank found himself telling Julia about his ranch, about the challenges of keeping a small operation running when the big cattle companies were trying to buy up all the land. He told her about his small herd of horses, which he bred and trained as a side business, and about his dreams of expanding the ranch someday. Julia, in turn, shared stories about her students in Oregon, about the little girl who had learned to read despite everyone saying she could not, about the boy who had shown remarkable talent for mathematics. Her love for teaching shone through every word, and Frank found himself captivated by her animation and warmth. The sun was setting by the time they emerged from the restaurant, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. The heat of the day had given way to a pleasant evening breeze. "I should get you to the boarding house," Frank said, though he found himself reluctant to end their time together. "Mrs. Henderson runs a respectable establishment. You will be comfortable there." "Thank you again for the meal and the company," Julia said as they walked. "I feel much better about my situation now." At the boarding house, a kindly older woman named Mrs. Henderson confirmed that Julia was expected and showed her to a clean, modest room. Frank waited downstairs, and when Julia came back down after depositing her carpetbag, she looked more refreshed despite the long day. "Mrs. Henderson says the family I am to work for will not be able to meet with me until Monday," Julia said. Apparently, there was indeed a mix-up with the dates. "I am to start teaching the week after next. That gives you some time to settle in and see the town," Frank said. He hesitated, then added, "I will be in Columbia tomorrow getting a few more supplies I need. If you would like, I could show you around, introduce you to some of the better citizens." Julia smiled, and Frank noticed the way it made her eyes crinkle at the corners. "I would like that very much, Mr. Easton." "Frank," he corrected gently. "Mr. Easton was my father." "Only if you call me Julia," she replied. "Julia," he repeated, liking the way her name felt on his tongue. "I will come by around 10 tomorrow morning if that suits you." "That would be perfect." Frank tipped his hat to her and walked back to his wagon, his mind already racing ahead to tomorrow. He had not felt this way about anyone in years, perhaps ever. There had been a brief courtship with a rancher's daughter when he was in his 20s, but it had ended when she decided she wanted city life rather than ranch life. Since then, Frank had thrown himself into his work, content with his solitary existence, but Julia was different. There was a strength to her, a resilience that matched her obvious kindness and intelligence. And the way she had looked at him over dinner, as if she truly saw him and appreciated what she saw, had awakened something in his heart that he had thought long dormant. That night, lying in his bedroll under the stars rather than paying for a room at the boarding house. Frank stared up at the vast expanse of sky and thought about green eyes and soft laughter. He was a practical man, not given to flights of fancy, but he could not shake the feeling that meeting Julia Vance was going to change his life. The next morning, Frank was at the boarding house promptly at 10, having spent an unusual amount of time making sure he was clean and presentable. He had even gone to the barber for a trim and a shave, earning a curious look from old Tom, who usually only saw Frank a few times a year. Julia emerged in a fresh dress of pale blue cotton, her dark hair neatly arranged. She looked well-rested and eager, and Frank felt his heart skip a beat at the sight of her. "Good morning," she said brightly. "I am ready for my tour of Columbia." Frank offered her his arm, and they set off down the street. He showed her the school where she would be teaching, a sturdy wooden building with a bell tower and large windows to let in light. Julia's face lit up as she looked at it. "It is wonderful," she breathed. "So much better than the little one-room schoolhouse I had in Oregon." They visited the general store, where Frank introduced her to Mr. Peterson, the proprietor, who promised to extend her credit until her first wages came through. They stopped by the church, where Reverend Matthews welcomed Julia warmly and invited her to Sunday services. They walked past the newspaper office, the bank, and the various shops that made up Columbia's commercial district. Throughout the morning, Frank noticed the way people's eyes followed them with curiosity. It was unusual for him to be seen escorting a lady around town, and he knew the gossips would be talking. But he found he did not care. Let them talk. He was proud to be seen with Julia for her part. Julia seemed genuinely interested in everything and everyone. She asked thoughtful questions and remembered names, already showing the kind of attention to detail that probably made her an excellent teacher. They stopped for lunch at a small cafe, and as they ate sandwiches and drank lemonade, Julia said, "Everyone here has been so kind. It is nothing like yesterday." "Those men yesterday were outsiders," Frank explained. "Mining speculators from San Francisco. They think they can come in here and do whatever they please because they have money. But the real Columbia, the people who have built their lives here, they are good folks." "Tell me more about your ranch," Julia said, leaning forward with interest. "What is it like living out there?" Frank's face softened as he talked about his land. "It is about 15 miles from town, up in the foothills. The house is not fancy, just a simple cabin my father built when he first claimed the land. But from the porch, you can see for miles. There is a creek that runs through the property, lined with willows and cottonwoods. In the spring, the meadows are covered with wildflowers. It is peaceful in a way that is hard to describe." "It sounds beautiful," Julia said wistfully. "I have spent so much of my life in towns and cities. I think I would like to see more of the countryside." "I could take you out there sometime if you would like," Frank offered, then worried he was being too forward. "That is, when you are more settled and if you think it would be proper." Julia's smile was warm. "I think I would enjoy that very much. Perhaps Mrs. Henderson could accompany us as a chaperone, to preserve propriety." "That is a fine idea," Frank agreed, relieved that she had not thought his invitation inappropriate. As the afternoon wore on, they walked to the edge of town where the buildings gave way to open land. Julia asked about the history of Columbia, and Frank told her what he knew about the gold rush days, when the town had swelled to over 5,000 people practically overnight. He pointed out the old mining claims, now mostly abandoned, and explained how the town had gradually transformed from a wild mining camp into a more settled community. "It must have been quite something to see in those early days," Julia mused. "My father used to tell stories about it," Frank said. He arrived in 1852, just a young man looking to make his fortune. He tried mining for a year and found just enough gold to buy his land. He decided ranching was more reliable than chasing gold dust. He sounds like a wise man. He had his moments, Frank agreed with a smile. He could be stubborn as a mule, but his heart was in the right place. They were walking back toward the boarding house when they encountered a family struggling with a wagon that had lost a wheel. Without hesitation, Frank went to help, and Julia immediately began entertaining the three young children while Frank and the father worked to fix the wheel. She told them stories and played simple hand games, and by the time the wheel was back on, the children were laughing and begging her not to leave. "You are very good with them," Frank observed as they finally continued on their way. "Children are easy," Julia said. "They just want attention and kindness. Adults are far more complicated." "Some adults," Frank corrected gently. "You seem pretty straightforward to me," Julia laughed. "I suppose I am. My sister always says I am too honest for my own good. I have never been skilled at the kind of social games some women play." "That is a quality I admire," Frank said seriously. "I have always believed in saying what you mean and meaning what you say." They had reached the boarding house, and Frank was reluctant to say goodbye. "I have to head back to the ranch tomorrow. Chores do not wait, unfortunately, but I will be back in town in a couple of weeks. May I call on you then?" "I would be disappointed if you did not," Julia replied, and there was something in her eyes that made Frank's heart race. That night, he lay in his bedroll again, but this time his thoughts were full of possibilities rather than simple attraction. He barely knew Julia, yet he felt drawn to her in a way he had never experienced before. She was intelligent and kind, strong yet gentle, and when she smiled at him, he felt like the luckiest man in California. The weeks that followed were both the longest and shortest of Frank's life. He threw himself into his work, repairing fences and tending to his cattle and horses, but his mind kept drifting to Julia. He wondered how she was settling into Columbia, whether she was enjoying her work at the school, whether she thought about him the way he thought about her. He made the trip to Columbia twice in those weeks, ostensibly for supplies but really to see Julia. Each visit, they spent time together, walking and talking, sharing meals, learning about each other. Frank met the family Julia was boarding with, the Harrisons, who had 3 children Julia would be teaching. He could see the children already adored her. Julia, for her part, seemed to genuinely enjoy Frank's company. She asked about his week, listened with real interest to his stories about ranch life, and shared her own experiences from the classroom. She told him about the challenges of teaching children of different ages and abilities in one room, about the satisfaction of watching a concept finally click for a struggling student. On his 3rd visit, 6 weeks after they had first met, Frank finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been burning in his mind. They were sitting on a bench outside the school, watching the sun set. Julia had just finished her day of teaching, and there was chalk dust on her dress and a tired but happy glow on her face. "Julia," Frank began, turning to face her, "I know we have not known each other very long, but I feel like I have known you forever. I think about you all the time when I am at the ranch. I find myself working harder so the chores will be done faster, and I can make the trip to town sooner. What I am trying to say is, I care about you very much, and I would like to court you properly, with the intention of something more permanent down the road." Julia's eyes had grown wide as he spoke, and for a moment, Frank feared he had misread her feelings entirely. But then her face broke into the most radiant smile he had ever seen. "Oh, Frank," she said softly, reaching for his hand. "I have been hoping you would say something like that. I feel the same way. When you are not here, I find myself looking forward to your visits, counting the days. I have never felt this way about anyone before. Frank felt relief and joy wash over him in equal measure. Really? You are not just being kind. I am always honest, remember? Julia said with a gentle laugh. Yes, really, I would be honored to have you court me. Frank squeezed her hand gently, mindful of propriety even as his heart soared. I will do this right, Julia. I will speak to the Harrisons, make sure they approve. I will come to town every Sunday after church. We can take walks, have dinners. Let people see that my intentions are honorable. I know they are, Julia said, her green eyes sparkling. You are the most honorable man I have ever met. And so began a courtship that would be talked about in Columbia for years to come. Every Sunday without fail, Frank would make the 15-mile journey from his ranch, arriving in time for church services. He would sit beside Julia in the pew, very aware of her presence, and afterward they would spend the day together. Sometimes they would go for long walks in the countryside surrounding Columbia, with Mrs. Harrison or another lady from the town acting as chaperone. Julia would exclaim over the wildflowers and the views, and Frank would point out landmarks and tell her stories about the land. Other times they would sit in the Harrisons' parlor, playing checkers or reading aloud to each other while the children played nearby. Frank introduced Julia to his world slowly but surely. He brought her books about ranching and cattle breeding, which she read with genuine interest. He taught her about the different types of grasses that grew in the foothills and how to tell good grazing land from poor. He showed her drawings of his ranch and talked about his plans for the future. Julia, in turn, opened Frank's mind to things he had never considered. She lent him novels and poetry, which he read late into the night by lamplight in his cabin. She talked about art and music and philosophy, subjects that had seemed frivolous to Frank before but which now fascinated him because they fascinated her. She challenged his opinions gently, making him think more deeply about the world around him. As autumn turned the hills golden and brown, their feelings for each other deepened from attraction to something far more profound. Frank found himself planning his future not as a solitary rancher, but as a man who would share his life with a remarkable woman. He began making improvements to his cabin, adding a second room and replacing the rough furniture his father had made with nicer pieces ordered from Sacramento. Julia, meanwhile, was thriving in her teaching position. The children loved her, and their parents frequently praised her methods and dedication. She had started a small lending library at the school, using her own books and donations from townspeople, and she stayed late many afternoons to help students who were struggling. It was during one of these late afternoons in October that Frank arrived in Columbia a day early, having finished his work sooner than expected. He went to the school and found Julia sitting with a young boy, patiently helping him sound out words from a primer. When she looked up and saw Frank in the doorway, her face lit up with such pure joy that Frank felt his breath catch. This was the woman he wanted to see every day for the rest of his life. After the boy had left and they were alone in the schoolroom, Frank took Julia's hands in his. "I love you," he said simply. "I have known it for weeks now, but I wanted to wait for the right moment to say it. Julia, you have changed everything for me. Before I met you, I was content with my life, but I did not know what I was missing. Now I cannot imagine going back to how things were before." Tears sparkled in Julia's eyes, but she was smiling. "I love you too, Frank. You are the kindest, most genuine man I have ever known. You make me feel safe and cherished and understood. I never thought I would find someone who accepted me exactly as I am." Frank pulled her close, holding her gently, breathing in the scent of her hair, which always smelled faintly of lavender. "Will you marry me, Julia?" I know I should probably wait longer, do this more formally, but I cannot help myself. I want you to be my wife. I want to build a life with you, a real partnership where we support each other's dreams and face whatever comes together." Julia pulled back just enough to look up at him, tears now streaming down her face. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you, Frank. There is nothing I want more." They were married 6 weeks later on a crisp December morning in Columbia's little church. The whole town turned out for the wedding, even the people who had been skeptical at first about the quick courtship. But anyone who saw Frank and Julia together could see the genuine love between them. Julia wore a simple white dress that the ladies of the town had helped her make, with a veil of delicate lace that had belonged to Mrs. Harrison's mother. Frank wore his best suit, his hair neatly trimmed, his face shining with happiness as he watched Julia walk down the aisle toward him. Reverend Matthews performed the ceremony, his voice warm and sincere as he spoke about the sacred bond of marriage. When Frank slipped the plain gold band onto Julia's finger, his hands were steady despite the emotion welling up inside him. When Julia said her vows, her voice was clear and strong, her eyes never leaving his face. The reception was held at Sadie's restaurant, which had been decorated with evergreen boughs and winter berries. There was dancing and laughter and more food than anyone could possibly eat. Frank danced with his new bride, holding her close, feeling like he was living in a dream. As the afternoon wore on and the celebration continued, Frank stole a moment alone with Julia in the quiet street outside. "Are you ready to see your new home?" he asked softly. "I have been ready for weeks," Julia replied, squeezing his hand. "Wherever you are, that is home to me." They left Columbia in Frank's wagon as the sun was setting, well-wishers throwing rice and calling out blessings. The 15-mile journey to the ranch took several hours in the darkness, but Frank knew every turn of the road by heart, and the horses were sure-footed. Julia sat close beside him, wrapped in blankets against the December cold, and they talked quietly about everything and nothing. Frank pointed out constellations in the clear night sky, and Julia told him about the astronomy books she had read as a child. They made plans for Christmas, which was just 2 weeks away, and discussed whether Julia should continue teaching or focus on the ranch. "I think I would like to keep teaching, at least for now," Julia said thoughtfully. "The children need me, and I love the work. But perhaps in time, when we have children of our own, I will teach them at home." The thought of children with Julia made Frank's heart swell. "Whatever you want, darling. I will support you in whatever you choose." When they finally arrived at the ranch, Frank helped Julia down from the wagon and then, before she could take a step toward the cabin, he swept her up in his arms. "Got to carry you over the threshold," he explained with a grin. "It is tradition." Julia laughed, her arms around his neck as he carried her to the door of their home. He had left lamps burning before he left for the wedding that morning, and the cabin glowed with warm light. Inside, Julia looked around with delight. Frank had cleaned every surface until it shone, and there were fresh flowers in a vase on the table, a luxury in December that must have cost him dearly. The new furniture he had ordered was arranged neatly, and a fire crackled cheerfully in the stone fireplace. "Oh, Frank," Julia breathed, "it is perfect." Over the next few months, they settled into married life with surprising ease. Julia continued teaching during the week, staying in Columbia with the Harrisons and spending weekends at the ranch with Frank. It was not an ideal arrangement, but it worked for them. Frank used the weekdays to focus on the heavier ranch work, and Julia threw herself into her teaching. Then, from Friday evening through Sunday afternoon, they were together, and those weekends were precious beyond measure. Julia brought life and light to the cabin. She hung curtains in the windows and put up shelves for books. She planted herbs in pots that sat on the windowsills, filling the air with the scent of rosemary and thyme. She learned to cook over the fireplace, and though her early attempts were sometimes unsuccessful, Frank ate everything with enthusiasm and praise. Frank, in turn, began teaching Julia about ranch work. She learned to ride, starting on a gentle mare named Daisy. At first, she was nervous, but Frank was patient, and soon she was confidently riding around the property, helping him check on cattle and mend fences. She had a natural way with the horses, speaking to them softly and treating them with kindness. As winter gave way to spring, Julia made a decision. She told the school board that she would finish out the academic year but would not be returning in the fall. She wanted to be at the ranch full-time, wanted to build a life with Frank without the constant back and forth. The townspeople were disappointed to lose such an excellent teacher, but they understood. A going-away party was held at the end of the school year, and there were tears and hugs and promises to visit. Now living at the ranch permanently, Julia threw herself into making it a true home. She started a vegetable garden, carefully tending tomatoes and beans and squash. She learned to preserve food for the winter, filling the pantry with jars of pickles and jams and canned vegetables. She took over the bookkeeping for the ranch, organizing Frank's haphazard records into neat ledgers that made it much easier to track expenses and income. But she also carved out time for her own interests. She continued to read voraciously, and she started writing letters to her sister back east, long, detailed letters about her new life. Frank built her a desk by the window where she could write and read in the afternoon light. One evening in late summer, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Julia turned to Frank with a mixture of nervousness and joy on her face. "Frank, I have something to tell you," she said softly. "I am going to have a baby." For a moment, Frank just stared at her, the words not quite registering. Then a slow smile spread across his face, growing wider and wider until he was grinning like a fool. "A baby," he repeated. "We are going to have a baby." "In February, I think," Julia said, and then she was laughing and crying at the same time as Frank pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of glass. "I am going to be a father," Frank said wonderingly. "Julia, you have just made me the happiest man in California." The pregnancy was not easy. Julia suffered from terrible morning sickness in the early months, and Frank was beside himself with worry. He hovered over her constantly until she finally snapped at him to give her some space. But even her irritation could not dampen his joy. As the months passed and Julia's belly grew round, Frank became even more protective. He took over all the heavy chores, insisting Julia rest as much as possible. He read every book he could find about childbirth and babies, determined to be prepared. In November, they made the difficult decision that Julia should stay in Colombia for the final months of the pregnancy. The journey to the ranch was too difficult in her condition, and they both wanted to be near the doctor when the time came. Frank closed up the cabin and moved to town as well, taking a job helping at the livery stable to pay for their room at the boarding house. It was strange being back in town after so many months at the ranch, but Frank did not mind. All that mattered was keeping Julia and the baby safe. The baby came on a snowy morning in February 1880 after a long and difficult labor. Frank paced outside the room where Julia labored, praying harder than he had ever prayed in his life. When he finally heard the cry of a newborn, he felt his knees go weak with relief. The midwife, Mrs. Cooper, came to the door with a tired but pleased smile. "You have a son, Mr. Easton, and your wife is doing just fine." Frank rushed into the room to find Julia propped up on pillows, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. He approached slowly, almost reverently, and when Julia pulled back the blanket to show him their son's face, Frank felt tears streaming down his cheeks. The baby had Julia's dark hair and what looked like it might be Frank's brown eyes. His tiny fists waved in the air, and his face was red from crying. "He is perfect," Frank whispered. "Absolutely perfect. What should we name him?" They had discussed names for months but had never quite settled on one. Now, looking at their son, Julia said, "What about James, after my father?" "James Easton." "James," Frank repeated, trying it out. "Yes, James Easton. Welcome to the world, little man." Those first weeks with a newborn were exhausting and overwhelming and absolutely wonderful. Frank learned to change diapers and warm bottles and walk the floor at 3 in the morning when James would not sleep. Julia recovered her strength slowly, and Frank took care of both her and the baby with patient devotion. They stayed in Colombia through the spring, giving Julia time to fully heal before attempting the journey back to the ranch. During that time, Frank realized how much he had missed the ranch, the open spaces, the quiet. He loved his son more than life itself, but he longed to raise him in the place that meant so much to him. Finally, in early April, when the weather had warmed and James was 2 months old, they made the journey home. Julia sat in the wagon with James in her arms, and Frank drove carefully, avoiding every bump and hole in the road. The cabin looked just as they had left it, and Frank felt a surge of contentment as he helped Julia and the baby inside. This was where his son would grow up, where he would learn to ride and work cattle and appreciate the land. This was home. Life on the ranch with a baby was challenging in ways Frank had never imagined. The work did not stop just because they had a newborn, and there were times when both he and Julia were so exhausted they could barely speak. But there were also moments of profound joy, like the first time James smiled at them or the first time he laughed, a sound like tinkling bells that filled the cabin with delight. As James grew from infant to toddler, the ranch prospered. Frank's careful management and hard work were paying off, and he was able to expand his herd and buy more land. Julia's organizational skills had streamlined their operations, and they were making more profit than Frank had ever managed on his own. But more than the financial success, it was the emotional richness of their life together that made Frank wake up grateful every morning. He and Julia had built something real and lasting, a partnership based on love and mutual respect. They still talked for hours, sharing their thoughts and dreams. They still laughed together, finding humor in the small disasters of daily life. And they still cherished their quiet moments together, whether it was watching the sunset from the porch or reading by the fire after James was asleep. When James was 2, Julia became pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, and in the spring of 1882 they welcomed a daughter they named Margaret, after Frank's mother. Where James had been a fussy baby, Margaret was calm and content, sleeping through the night almost from the beginning. Frank adored his daughter, marveling at her tiny features and the way she seemed to study everything around her with serious blue eyes. Julia teased him about being wrapped around Margaret's little finger, but Frank did not mind. He had never imagined he could love anyone as much as he loved Julia, but his children had expanded his heart in ways he had not thought possible. The years that followed were full and busy. James grew into a sturdy, adventurous boy who followed Frank around the ranch like a shadow, asking endless questions and wanting to help with everything. Margaret was quieter but just as curious, content to sit and watch for long periods before surprising everyone with an astute observation. Julia had her hands full with 2 young children and the work of the ranch, but she never complained. She had found a deep satisfaction in this life, so different from what she had imagined for herself as a young woman. She sometimes missed teaching, and she made sure to spend time each day working on letters and numbers with James, but she did not regret her choice. Frank and Julia made a point of taking the family to Columbia at least once a month, keeping up with friends and attending church. They wanted their children to have a sense of community, to know that they were part of something larger than just their ranch. On one such trip, when James was 5 and Margaret was 3, they encountered the men who had harassed Julia on that first day in Columbia, so many years ago. The men were leaving the saloon, clearly drunk, and one of them sneered at Frank. Well, if it isn't the cowboy and his charity case," the man slurred. "Still together, I see. Guess desperation makes strange bedfellows." Frank felt his jaw tighten, but before he could respond, Julia put a hand on his arm. "We are more than together," she said calmly, looking the man directly in the eye. "We are happy. We have a beautiful family and a good life. I hope someday you find the same kind of happiness, though I doubt you will as long as you carry so much bitterness in your heart." She said it without anger, almost with pity, and the man seemed taken aback. He muttered something and stumbled away, and Frank looked at his wife with renewed admiration. "That was well handled," he said. "I learned from the best," Julia replied, squeezing his hand. "You showed me on that first day that cruelty does not deserve our anger, just our pity. Those men are to be pitied, not feared." As James and Margaret grew older, Frank and Julia settled into a comfortable rhythm. The children were old enough now to have real chores, and Frank took pleasure in teaching his son the skills his own father had taught him. James learned to rope and brand cattle, to mend fences, and to care for the horses. Margaret, meanwhile, showed a remarkable talent for working with the animals. The horses especially seemed to respond to her gentle touch and quiet voice. Julia had started teaching the children more formally, setting aside time each morning for lessons in reading, writing, arithmetic, and history. She had sent away for textbooks and supplies, creating a little schoolroom in one corner of the now expanded cabin. Both children were bright and eager to learn, though James was easily distracted and Margaret would lose herself in books for hours if allowed. In 1887, when James was 7 and Margaret was 5, Julia discovered she was pregnant again. This time, she was less anxious, more confident in her body's ability to bring a child into the world. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and in early spring they welcomed another son whom they named Samuel. Samuel was a happy, easy baby who seemed to bring joy wherever he went. James and Margaret adored their little brother, and Frank joked that they were going to spoil him rotten with all their attention. Life continued in this pleasant way for several years. The ranch continued to prosper, and Frank was able to hire a couple of ranch hands to help with the heavier work. This gave him more time to spend with his family, which he treasured. He and Julia would sometimes steal away for an afternoon ride, leaving the children with the hands. They would ride to their favorite spot by the creek, where the willow trees provided shade and the water burbled over smooth stones. There, they would sit and talk, reconnecting in a way that the busyness of daily life sometimes prevented. "You ever regret it?" Frank asked during one such afternoon when they had been married for nearly 10 years. Giving up teaching to come out here, Julia considered the question seriously. "Sometimes I miss the classroom," she admitted, "but I would not trade this life for anything. I get to teach my own children, and I have you in this beautiful place. No, Frank, I have no regrets. Do you? About asking that dusty, disheveled stranger to supper all those years ago?" Frank pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "Not for a single moment. That was the best decision I ever made. You are my partner, my best friend, the love of my life. I thank God for you every single day." As their children grew into young people, Frank and Julia marveled at the individuals they were becoming. James, now a teenager, had grown tall and strong, with his father's work ethic and his mother's quick mind. He was talking about expanding the ranch someday, maybe moving into breeding horses more seriously. Margaret, 11 years old, was thoughtful and creative, always sketching in the journals Frank brought her from town. She had declared that she wanted to be an artist when she grew up, and Julia encouraged her, sending away for art supplies and books about famous painters. Samuel, now 6, was the charmer of the family, able to make anyone smile with his quick wit and endless energy. He followed his older siblings around adoringly, always wanting to be part of whatever they were doing. In 1893, 15 years after that fateful day in Columbia, Frank and Julia took a trip back east to visit Julia's sister in Boston. It was the first time they had been away from the ranch together since their honeymoon, and it felt strange and exciting to be just the two of them again, even temporarily. The children stayed with trusted friends in Columbia, and Frank and Julia took the train across the country. Julia had not seen her sister in all these years, though they had maintained a faithful correspondence. The reunion was tearful and joyful, and Frank liked Sarah immediately. She had become a successful nurse and was engaged to a doctor. During their week in Boston, Frank and Julia walked through the bustling streets, visited museums and theaters, and ate at fine restaurants. It was a different world from their ranch in California, loud and crowded and fast-paced. Frank found it overwhelming, and he could see that Julia did too. "I had forgotten how noisy cities are," she said one evening as they walked back to their hotel. "I thought I would miss this, the culture and the excitement, but really I just want to go home." "Me too," Frank admitted. "This has been wonderful, but I miss the ranch. I miss the quiet. I miss our children." They cut their trip short by a few days, eager to get back to California. When they finally arrived home and were reunited with James, Margaret, and Samuel, Frank felt a profound sense of contentment. This was where he belonged, with his family, on this land they had built a life on together. The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and challenges. There were droughts that tested their resources and their resolve. There were harsh winters that cost them cattle and required back-breaking work to get through. There were illnesses and accidents that reminded them how fragile life could be. But through it all, Frank and Julia faced everything together. Their love, which had begun with a simple act of kindness and a shared meal, had deepened into something unshakable. They had built not just a ranch but a legacy, a family bound by love and respect. As Frank approached his 50s and Julia her late 40s, they watched their children begin to make their own paths in the world. James had indeed expanded the horse breeding operation and was making a name for himself throughout California for the quality of his stock. Margaret had surprised everyone by falling in love with a young man from Columbia, the son of the new schoolteacher, who shared her love of art. They were planning to marry in the spring. Samuel, now a strapping young man of 18, had announced his intention to study law, wanting to help protect ranchers' rights as more big companies tried to move into the area. Frank and Julia were proud of all their children, amazed at the people they had become. On a warm summer evening in 1898, exactly 20 years after the day Frank had defended Julia from cruel words in Columbia, they sat together on their porch, watching the sun set over the hills. The house was quiet for once, all the children off on their own pursuits. 20 years, Julia mused, her hand in Frank's. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like we have always been together. "I was just a cowboy loading supplies onto a wagon," Frank said. "I had no idea that day would change my entire life. I was so scared and alone, Julia remembered. "And then you were there, standing up for me when no one else would. I think I started falling in love with you in that moment." "I fell in love with you over beef stew and apple pie," Frank said with a smile. "Watching the way your face lit up when you talked about teaching, the way you were kind even to those men who had been cruel to you." Julia turned to look at him, and even after 20 years, Frank still felt his heart skip when she smiled at him. "We have built a good life, have we not?" "The best life," Frank agreed. "Better than I ever dreamed possible. You gave me everything, Julia. A home filled with love and laughter, children I am proud of, a partnership that makes every day worthwhile. I would not change a single thing." "Not even the time Samuel tried to ride that wild stallion and broke his arm?" Julia asked with a laugh. "Well, maybe that," Frank conceded, grinning. "But even the hard times were worth it because we faced them together." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sky turn from gold to pink to purple. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and the evening breeze carried the scent of sage and summer grass. "You know what I think about sometimes," Julia said softly. "Those men who were so cruel to me that day. They were right about one thing, though they did not mean it kindly. I did bring you something. I brought you my whole heart, my whole self, and you gave me yours in return." Frank raised her hand to his lips, kissing it gently. "You brought me everything, darling. Purpose and joy and love beyond measure. I hope I have given you even half of what you have given me." "You have given me the world," Julia whispered. "You have given me a life I never dared to dream of." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they remained on the porch, two people who had found each other against the odds and built something beautiful and lasting. The ranch that Frank had once worked alone now thrived as a family enterprise. The cabin that had been a bachelor's simple shelter was now a warm, welcoming home filled with memories and love. In the years that followed, Frank and Julia became grandparents, delighting in Margaret's children and later James's and Samuel's. They grew old together gracefully, their love only deepening with time. Frank's hair turned silver, and Julia's dark locks became streaked with white. But when they looked at each other, they still saw the young man who had defended a stranger and the young woman who had thanked him with such heartfelt gratitude. They continued to work the ranch well into their 60s, though they gradually turned over more responsibility to James and his family, who had moved into a house they built on the property. Frank still rose early every morning to check on the horses, and Julia still tended her garden and kept the books. On quiet evenings, they would sit on that same porch where they had spent so many hours over the years, holding hands and watching the sunset. Sometimes they talked, sharing thoughts and memories. Sometimes they simply sat in companionable silence, needing no words to communicate their feelings. In the summer of 1910, when Frank was 64 and Julia was 60, they celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary with a big party at the ranch. All their children and grandchildren were there, along with friends from Columbia and neighboring ranches. There was music and dancing and more food than anyone could eat, just like their wedding all those years ago. As Frank danced with Julia under the stars, holding her close while a fiddler played a waltz, he thought about the journey they had taken together. From that chance encounter in a dusty street to this moment, surrounded by the family they had created and the life they had built, it had been an incredible ride. "I love you," he whispered in her ear. "More today than yesterday and less than tomorrow." Julia smiled up at him, her green eyes still bright despite the years. "I love you too, Frank Easton. You are my hero, my partner, my everything. Thank you for asking that dusty stranger to supper all those years ago." "Thank you for saying yes," Frank replied. "Best decision either of us ever made." They continued to dance as the stars wheeled overhead and their family laughed and celebrated around them. Two people who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and built a love that would last a lifetime and beyond. A legacy of kindness and respect and devotion that would carry on through their children and grandchildren for generations to come. In the end, that was what mattered most. Not the ranch, though it was successful. Not the material things they had accumulated, though they had built a comfortable life. What mattered was the love they shared, the family they had raised, the way they had faced every challenge together with courage and grace. Frank and Julia lived well into their 70s, enjoying their later years surrounded by family and friends. They remained on the ranch, in the cabin that had grown and changed over the years, but was still fundamentally the same place Frank's father had built so long ago. When Frank finally passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 76, Julia mourned him deeply, but took comfort in knowing that they had loved each other well and completely for nearly 40 years. She followed him 2 years later, her heart simply giving out one quiet morning as she sat in the chair by the window where she had spent so many hours reading and writing over the years. Her children found her there, a peaceful expression on her face, a smile on her lips as if she were dreaming of something wonderful. They buried Julia next to Frank on a hillside overlooking the ranch, where wildflowers grew in spring and the view stretched for miles. Their children and grandchildren gathered to remember them, sharing stories about their love and their lives, about the legacy of kindness and devotion they had left behind. And if you visited that ranch today, generations later, you would still hear stories about Frank and Julia Easton, about how a cowboy defended a stranger from cruel words one summer day in 1878, how she thanked him and he asked her to supper, and how that simple act of kindness blossomed into one of the greatest love stories the California foothills had ever known. Their descendants still work that land, still tell those stories, still remember the power of standing up for what is right, and the magic that can happen when two people find each other and choose love every single day for the rest of their lives.